So the first presentation today is by Professor Myria Georgiou on the book The Digital Border, Migration, Technology and Power, co-authored with Lilie Chouliaraki. Myria Georgiou is a professor of media and communications at the London School of Economics, where she also serves as research director. She's the author, editor and co-editor of 5 books, including Diaspora, Identity and the Media, Media and the City, Cosmopolitanism and Difference, and the Sage Handbook of Media and Migration. And Myria, now the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Koen. Thanks to all the organizers. I mean, this is the most wonderful opportunity to have the first launch for our book, which is formally published today or yesterday, I think. So, and it's such a joy to be here, to be invited, and also such an honor to be among such a wonderful and challenging intellectual company. So I'm talking here on my behalf and the behalf of Lilie Chouliaraki, my co-author who can't be here and who is here in spirit, however. So we'll be talking about this new book, and perhaps before I move to talking about the specificities of the book, let us remind ourselves in which context it was written. Images of narratives and visual and textual narratives of polarization and hostility among migrants is something we see all the time. Occasionally, we see those narratives of polarization and hostility replaced by narratives, visual and textual narratives of ecstatic humanitarianism, like those that we saw back in September 2015, and which perhaps we see sometimes now around the Ukrainian crisis. Moments that are iconic, even if ephemeral. We have also, of course, images like these that reflect the experiences of digital migration and the technologies that are both enabling and supporting mobility, but of course, which are controlling it. These images, of course, are also familiar to the audience in this room and in the virtual room. And there are images that remind us that, of course, mediation of migration is not just its mere reflection. As we now know, migration is narrated, imagined, and experienced across material and digital spaces and through technologies of mobility, containment, and control, what we call in our book, the digital border. I'm here to talk today about our conception of the digital border as it unravels in our new book with the same title. The digital border, we argue, encompasses the asymmetrically and differentially constituted networks of actors, technologies, and spaces that shape now geographies of transnational mobility. This transnational mobility, of course, as we also know, is a differential mobility that includes systems of control and immobility that divide those who have the right to cross borders and celebrate some of those who have the rights to cross borders and marginalizes those who don't. It divides those who have the right to recognition across territories and screens from those who don't. Specifically, as you can see on the screen, the aim of the digital border is to interrogate the dominant rationality that racializes, controls, and surveys the right to mobility and the right to protection. It unpacks and explores the border's networks of mediation and discourse, as well as it critically reflects on the implication that these both have for migrants, but also the societies that receive them. In our book, we situate the complex geography and timeline of migration within what we refer to as the techno-symbolic governmentality of migration, meaning more or less the technologies and representations that frame conceptions, imaginings and practices of the outer and inner border of nations, and in our case, specifically of Europe. We do so in the context of the so-called 2015 migration crisis, but also its aftermath, as that spills all the way to the present, and of course, we think to the future. Within an understanding of migration situated within systems of symbolic and territorial systems of control and containment, we think through that initial moment of the so-called crisis, not only as a contained set of events in 2015, but actually as a period within a temporal continuum, where the meaning of crisis spills over subsequent years and still infuses the meanings of the digital border today. Empirically, that means that we examine the trajectory of the so-called crisis through the period of 2015-2020, what could be referred to as the performative peak and the performative aftermath of a crisis. And a crisis, of course, is always in quotation marks, which we can discuss later on. At the heart of our analysis is our attempt to illustrate how this techno-symbolic governmentality of migration is constituted territorially as well as symbolically. The border, of course, has always had a territorial constitution, yet now this territoriality becomes more flexible, more expansive. It is expressed now in the ever-converging synergies of media technologies and human mobility, increasingly as it expands across technologies of surveillance and control from the external border of Europe all the way to European cities. At the outer border, we saw and we know that biometric information and individual data profiles are constructed in processes of assortment of those who have the right to move from those considered as unworthy of doing so. These databases, and other speakers will talk about these issues more eloquently still, these databases increasingly converge with data on migrant health, education, and employment, and all the information that migrants choose or have no choice but to choose when they share information about their everyday life on social media. Thus, the territorial border is turning into a configuration of intersecting logics of identification, classification, and control that does not only profoundly shape policies of security, but also what Yuval Davis and colleagues call Western states-owned political projects of belonging. The border is also constituted symbolically, we argue. Narratives of migration in online news, social media, and institutional web platforms engage in parallel practices of power alongside the processes of datification and surveillance. Embedded within their own networks of mediation, such narratives also form part of the border's logic of identification and control, in that they publicly legitimize certain discourses of migration over others. And in so doing, of course, they contribute to the biopolitical power relations of human mobility. This speciality, this complex speciality of the border, is shaped in line with the border's temporal trajectories. Thus, our approach within a long continuum of the temporality of migration. In the complex temporality of migration, we have seen that linguistic binary of the victim threat, the migrant as either a victim as threat, which has long been mobilized to divide newcomers between those deserving care and those requiring containment or exclusion, what we refer to as humanitarian securitization, emerging and re-emerging, providing a fundamental and dominant discourse of understanding in the migration. Also in the post-crisis temporality, we saw this frame of the humanitarian securitization that divides victims from threats becoming complemented, not replaced, but becoming complemented by another binary through which migrants are recognized or rather misrecognized. And this new binary, or this additional binary, is that of entrepreneurial securitization, which conceives migrants who are either capable of making it, succeeding in European urban markets, or as unworthy of joining the national community, remaining thus a threat to security and the so-called well-being of worthy citizens. Our inquiry into the digital border, then, is an inquiry into how, both on location and on screen, at the moment of crisis and its aftermath, the technological and symbolic resources of the border work through specific networks of mediation to situate migrant bodies and identity on the boundary of the inside and outside. Yet, and importantly, we also try to show in the book that the border can never become fully encompassing, and it can never fully contain and control people and ideas. But it also produces, it doesn't only ignore, but actually produces spaces of resistance and struggle against these racial and class exclusions. In the next few minutes, what I would like to do is to speak a bit more and in a bit more detail about the architecture of the digital border as we develop it in the book, first in relation to its territoriality and then to its symbolic constitution. So let me start, as we do in the book, by unfolding in brief how we understand the territorial border. Simply put, the territorial border is a site of marking national sovereignty and control of territories by the state. This is what we usually take for granted in our understanding of territorial borders. However, the territorial border is no longer just dependent on military force and clearly dividing lines, but is manifested through the digitized and perpetual micro-monitoring of human bodies. And it includes both militarized security and biopolitics. Let me explain what we mean. So the territorial border is first and fundamentally, of course, marked through the external boundaries of the nation state, and in our case of Europe, European Union. Our own understanding of our own empirical understanding of the outer territorial border comes from our research at the island of Chios in Greece, one of the two main reception points of migrants in 2015. We draw on online observations and interviews, which we have collected during our fieldwork on the island in December 2015. And here we develop our conception of the regime of humanitarian securitization. This regime, we argue, is organized around a robust but invisible assemblage of mediations that organizes the bureaucratic monitoring, professionalized care, and activist hospitality for those arriving. These systems, these assemblages we observed emerge across three autonomous but not completely separate domains of migrant reception. Military securitization, which relates to the reception center that you can see here, controlled by military forces. Securitized care, the humanitarian support that is offered by UN and other humanitarians. And compassionate solidarity, as this is expressed in spaces of voluntary activism. Through our ethnographic insight of the outer border in winter 2015, we show in the book how these different actors of the border repeatedly use both news and the narratives that are established around migration and that are produced by different media, as well as technologies of communication, such as their own social media networks, such as WhatsApp, to organize reception, but also to make sense of who these newcomers are, and most importantly, how they should be treated, how they should be managed. Networks of mediation that very often, and as a rule, exclude migrants themselves, but they are very actively engaged the different actors of reception. And I don't have time here to talk about it in detail, but I'm happy to come back to the Q&A to it. But what we found out is that even if in diverse and competing ways, we show in the book how these different domains and how these different actors have something in common. And what they have in common is very much their functioning around an imaginary of crisis, a social imaginary of crisis that defines migrants as fundamentally different and external to Europe. While we start from the outer border of Europe, however, we argue that the digital border now extends across European cities. In our rival cities where we conducted research, such as in Athens, Berlin, and London, we have seen institutional acts of welcome. Institutional acts of welcome, which, however, what they do is that they produce and reproduce hierarchical networks of reception. hierarchical networks that are created and very often sustained through social media and web projects. This welcome, we often saw, promotes and establishes a normative regime of reception, what we call the regime of entrepreneurial securitization. This is a regime premised upon the obligation for migrants to comply with the neoliberal logic of work in order to obtain not only economic benefit, but also legal status, but also a sense of self-worth and community belonging. So the language of the market is the language that mediates on social media, on web platforms, the right of many migrants to actually reach and seek and reach recognition. And this regime is increasingly rooted digitally. For example, there's overinvestment in many cities in digital training and digital work because this is considered as the best way to so-called integration, disproportionately supported with public funds compared to, for example, housing or other forms of education. At the same time, we see how cities have become extended locations of data governance of migrant rights and mobility, as migrants' data profiles, which are initially constituted, and the information that is initially collected here in places like that at the outer border, are then complemented by data and individual information which is collected while people are at work, education and health, and where citizens such as teachers, professors and doctors are expected to act as border guards who have to report any so-called suspicious activity among migrants. Importantly, however, we also observed, like many other people who are conducting research in this field and many of our some of the speakers today, that the border can never fully contain and discipline people and ideas. The potential for resistance finds expression in different ways and often emerges through tactical mobilizations of different border actors. And the different border actors that we're referring here include activists, volunteers, local residents, but of course and importantly migrants themselves, who engage on networks that expand across cities, material and digital streets. Tactical mobilization, for example, mobilizations take place around access to language learning, informal systems of access to language learning, participation in neighborhood public life, but also include political efforts for recognition of migrants as agents of change and actors with political agency who can and should participate in urban societies. These different online and offline mobilizations potentially turn migrant claims to rights and voice into what we call urban networked commons. And these are informal formations, physical and symbolic spaces of informal and sometimes underground, subversive, and often criminalized by the state forms of collaboration and collective action. Such mobilizations open up the possibility for migrants, activists, and volunteers to challenge the criminalization practices at work, both of humanitarian securitization, fighting, for example, against laws that turn migrant rescue into a punishable deed, and in entrepreneurial securitization, working with migrants outside the framework of the neoliberal entrepreneurial security to advance access to knowledge and work, but also to rights and expression of political agency. Fundamental to our conception of the digital border is the entanglement of the territorial processes of the border with its symbolic constitution. Thus, our analysis of the territorial border is tied to that of the symbolic. This emphasis to symbolic processes of migration's governmentality comes precisely from the role that we can see both mainstream media and social media playing in constructing narratives of the migrant as a distinct category. These narratives on the one hand, shape migrant as other and fundamentally different to the Western white subject. On the other hand, they shape migrants as speaking subjects. So we see an increasing sensitization, if you like, of in media representations, where migrants become more often, and especially in the Ukrainian context, we see that more and more, they become speaking subjects who, however, often narrate stories with very specific voices, voices that are contained within that of the victim or entrepreneur. So conditional ways of speaking. What we repeatedly observed across the digital media spaces of Europe is linguistic and visual strategies that mostly portray migrants in terms of numbers, on the one hand, and again, as one-dimensional figures that exist outside biographical contexts and geopolitical histories, and mostly as exceptional cases. In parallel to our studies of the visuality and the textuality of the moments of crisis, our research in post-crisis storytelling shows how the figure of the migrant entrepreneur is positioned within a hierarchy that validates this figure as a successful businessman or businesswoman, that exceptional figure we should be celebrating, while at the same time vilifying and excluding those who are unable or who refuse to engage with the economic rationalities of Western capitalism. Our analysis of the symbolic border then expands across three narrative spaces: the textual representations of migrants in news, their visual representations in photojournalism, and the textual and visual construction of migrants as speaking subjects in institutional and grassroots digital platforms. And I would like to briefly outline how we discuss these three spheres. So let me first outline what we found out in relation to the remediation of migration in online news storytelling. Our analytical focus here is voice. Who speaks? That is, who are the subjects of voice in migration news? In what capacity? So what is the status of voice? And within which context? The context of voice. Our analysis here comes from research at the Department of Media and Communications we engage with colleagues and students, and which includes 1,200 news articles from across Europe's press media. And what we saw here repeatedly is the systematic silencing of migrants during that period of the crisis. Media representations of migrants relied not so much on a rigid and clear and repetitive binary between the victim and terrorist, as they did on the shifting articulation of the two within the fluid regime of humanitarian securitization. So that fluid regime, those categories of the victim and terrorist become quite fluid, and they fluctuated between moments of tolerance, empathy, and fear for them. Silencing in this erratic discursive context, we demonstrate in our analysis, is accomplished through persistent representations of migrants as abstract and art historical figures that lack voice and agency. To use a key example, of course, from the 2015 crisis, the death of the Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi in September 2015, we know that it triggered a temporary moment of ecstatic humanitarianism, a moment that privileged the need for care for migrant children and families, of course, as victims, victims that remain silent, victims that remain without political agency. This moment, of course, was abruptly reversed after the Paris attacks in November of the same year, where we saw the swift replacement of this ecstatic humanitarianism with denunciatory vocabulary against migrants who now have become terrorists. What this example highlights is not only that migrants are trapped in the polarity of innocence and malevolence, but also that it is important to focus on the semantic politics of substitutability. substitutability around the signifier migrant, that empty signifier that is redefined within that social imaginary of crisis. What that means is that the category of migrant is shaped within wider political agendas, and it has become deeply embedded in the tactical shifts within the power regimes of the border between humanitarian and entrepreneurial securitization. The vocabulary of the migrant, thus, should not be seen as a fixed binary, but as consisting of differential and relatively diverse floating signifiers in Hall's words that attach different meanings to those arriving from elsewhere or those perceived as not belonging here, in line with the power context within which its signifier occurs. We also analyze the visual remediation of migrants in the photojournalism of migration during the same period of time, the peak of the crisis. And what we found out is that Western media do not just engage in framing migrant voices, but also construct frames of Western responsibility vis-à-vis migrant arrivals, where the narrative, the moral narrative of how we understand migration is about us. Approaching photojournalism as a moralizing project that invites its publics to offer a response to the spectacle of migration, we found 5 key patterns of migrant visibility across 51 front-page online images from 5 European national news media websites. These patterns include monitorial, charitable, securitizing, activist, and post-humanitarian responsibility. Despite this broad range of proposals that we saw, the news economy of visibility systematically employs strategies of dehumanization that throughout these images represent the migrant as a deeply ambivalent figure, whether this is a body in need, a powerless child, a racial other, a celebrity token, or a sentimental drawing. And in so doing, our analysis invites us to fundamentally rethink how we understand the media's own responsibility towards migrants and how the media visually reproduces a moral order that provides the lens for Western publics to consider their responsibilities and actions in that context of migration. As with the territorial border, the symbolic border represents a complex side of migrant governmentality. So the third and last part of our analysis here moves away from the mainstream media and towards digital platforms through which migrants emerge as the main speaking subjects. And here we specifically examine how migrants speak on institutional and grassroots digital platforms. And such platforms appear as framing their own discourses outside and in part against mainstream media. Through an analysis of 4 Europe-wide institutional and grassroots online initiatives in the course of the last 5 years, we found the constitution of the migrant as a subaltern actor, again in quotation marks, that often appears to unsettle, even if briefly, the symbolic boundary and the binaries of inside and outside. We saw those networks diversifying over time, but we saw also how subalternity is mobilized in different and sometimes competing projects of voice, subordinating this voice to official discourse of the abject victim or the resilient entrepreneurial migrant again and repeatedly in those so-called positive institutional sides, but also but also enabling to speak in its own terms in many of the grassroots initiatives that destabilize the dominant narrative media to claim autonomous identity. The digital border I try to show in this overview, this brief overview of our book, is a hybrid terrain of techno-symbolic contestations where security, care, solidarity, and activism coexist in different and precarious combinations. What connects the diverse techno-symbolic systems of migration governance that we studied into an assemblage of mediations is that through their technologies and platforms, in their different ways, they mobilize normative criteria of valorization that are inherently racialized, whether in machine coding or language semantics. However, these different systems appear as natural, normalized, and necessary practices of protection of the Western citizen, of territories, markets, and cultures. Who is allowed entry and who remains outside depends not only on the biopolitical practices of racialized classification and valorization that each technosymbolic assemblage mobilizes, but comes to also reproduce and legitimize these same hierarchies of human life that led to migration, mass migration in the first place. Thus, and as I come to an end, let me summarize. The digital border represents more than a mere manifestation of racial and data capitalism, we argue, and its technologies of control. Instead, and importantly, it is deeply embedded in its constitution, the constitution of racial and data capitalism. This happens as the border involves a hybrid configuration of space-time that encompasses both the liminal context of outer points, but also everyday life in cities. It relies upon various double articulations of technology with meaning that bring together datification with embodied encounters. But it also entails both regulation and resistance, which means that the border's symbolic and material violence generates the need and action for alternative expressions of voice, acts of subversion that destabilize, at least temporarily, its hierarchies of life and its technologies of assortment between those who deserve life and dignity and those who don't. Thank you. Should I sit down?
Thank you very much, Myria. We have now scheduled 2 responses. The first response will be by Professor Huub Dijsselbloem, Professor of Philosophy of Science, Technology and Politics, and Director of the Institute of Advanced Study of the University of Amsterdam. If you like, you can sit there or move here, which you prefer. You can. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Still alive? Yeah. Dear Myria, thank you for a wonderful presentation and congratulations with your book. It was wonderful to read. And it must be such an enormous thrill to be able to present it for a real audience after all the writing and all the hard work you have done. Wonderful. It was an enormous pleasure to read the book and I really enjoyed it. Also because it has 2 authors. It's quite special to see how well the combination works out and how vibrant your joint thinking and writing must have been. So I'd like to hear more about that process as well. What is the contribution of this book? The literature on migration, borders, and the digital has shown tremendous growth with many ramifications and refinements, empirical, ethical, methodological, and conceptual. And over the past decades, digital technologies have become increasingly important, at least in 3 respects. First of all, border control itself has been datafied with the development of large databases, the interoperability between these systems, the digital connection of migration to all parts of societies, housing, healthcare, education, labor, and the rise of AI applications. Secondly, data traffic between migrants has also increased, not only social, economic, and financial exchanges, but also the connection to travel networks, labor networks, financial networks, and for instance, what you describe as the process of entrepreneurial securitization. Thirdly, migration has become increasingly visual. Images circulating in various media, graphs provided by states, the EU, academics and NGOs, visualizations of dramatic events, migration has become a permanent part of the media sphere. What I really appreciate about this book is that it grasps these 3 developments simultaneously, and tries to understand their connections. And it does so against the background of an argument about structural equality, global justice, and freedom of movement. On top of that, the authors not only write in a very engaging style, the structure of the book is also really well organized. In the first section of the book on the territorial border, one of the central notions they apply is mediation. At this point, I think it's useful to share a little bit of my own background. As we will see in a moment, I study borders and human mobility by building on philosophy of technology, political theory, and science and technology studies in relation to all kinds of other studies relevant to this. So we will return to the notion of mediation soon. But from that perspective, I was most impressed by how the authors refine and elaborate on that notion of mediation. They not only managed to refine mediation as an existing notion and elaborate on it by suggesting the concepts of remediation, intermediation, and transmediation, but they also managed to turn it from what I would call a more conceptual analytic tool, a technical term, into a substantial notion when they introduced the idea of networked commons, which I found a really interesting shift, also from the conceptual to the substantial. The question, my first question that came to my mind is whether giving the variety, perhaps even the abundance of forms of mediation, do you also see processes of demediation? It's probably a provocative question to ask to a media scholar, but would it make sense to also pay attention to unmediated events, where, for instance, people, power, technology are extremely present? How would that relate to your approach? The second section of the book is on the symbolic border. There you move from an analysis of narrative and voice in news stories to a discussion of visibility and responsibility in news imagery. Although, as we will see, there are many similarities in approach and selections of topics and fieldwork and empirical analysis between this book and my book, such as the analysis of human mobility and border control on the Greek Aegean Islands in chapter 1, 2, and 3. I was also particularly intrigued by chapter 5. In that chapter, the authors explicitly address the question of the moral significance of the imagery of migrants. Instead of, and I quote them now, defining responsibility in terms of given pathologies of mediation, they mobilize responsibility as a heuristic term that enables us to explore how the concept is discursively used to invest the various visualities of the migration crisis with distinct moral claims to action. They continue with analyzing visualities of responsibility, monitorial responsibility, empathetic responsibility, responsibility of security, and even post-humanitarian responsibility. And it comes as no surprise that the authors, after such a thorough analysis, conclude that there is not so much a migration crisis, but a crisis of responsibility itself. I think this point deserves more attention in our research and in future research projects, because the question how responsibility is distributed and networked in a mediated and a visual way is highly relevant and still, I think, understudied. Finally, I think there's a really interesting connection between your work and my work with regard to the notion of infrastructure. I'm sure we will continue the conversation on that. In particular, because the book explicitly relates the techno-symbolic infrastructures of the territorial border to the platform narratives of the symbolic border. I think it's not just the notion of infrastructure that is relevant here, but also the approach that comes with it, an approach that focuses on mediation and movement. And since your book elaborates so much on the notion of mediation, I would be curious to hear more about how you think your book contributes to future research in a methodological way. What kind of methods did you actually develop? Can you be more explicit about the method you used and you developed and what it is, a method to study the digital borders? Well, in short, I think the authors have done an amazing job. It's an enormous achievement to develop new perspectives and to make new combinations between new and existing concepts in a field that does not suffer from a shortage of theory, to put it mildly, already. So I highly recommend reading it. Thank you.
Secondly, I'd like to invite up to the stage Professor Sandra Ponsanesi, Chair of Media, Gender and Postcolonial Studies at the Department of Media and Culture and the Graduate Gender Program, who brings in expertise on gender and postcolonial critique from a comparative and interdisciplinary perspective. Yours, Sandra.
Okay. Let me change glasses. Wonderful to be here. It's amazing that this enormous book launch has been organized with a stellar colleague. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a magnificent occasion, I think, not only to be among this distinguished colleague, but it's also an academic celebration of more recent work, but also a beautiful occasion to showcase connection and long-term collaboration on migration and borders in a digital datified world. So it's actually an intellectual harvest as well as a much deserved recognition for the field of digital migration studies that has acquired autonomy and authority in the last decades, also championed and heralded by the work and organizational talent of Kundurs, who are very thankful for bringing us all together in this post-COVID celebration. I think this book launch brings together people who have actually shared interest, expertise, but also commitment to issues of migration and humanitarianism in a digital age, in which the complexity of technology and increased datification and algorithmization, advanced capitalism and extraction, surveillance and securitization, goes hand in hand with new forms of resistance, speaking back, and protest. This is for me a special honor to give a response to Lilie and Myria's wonderful book, The Digital Border, Migration, Technology, and Power, as you just heard, also very fresh from NYU Press. I've been inspired by their very individual work for many years now, but it's important and beautiful to see how the synergy of their engagement and ethical commitment come together in this book on the digital border. So it's a special honor and also a big treat. I will not repeat the wonderful and careful response of Hoop, who through this book has so many connections and deep philosophical and technological entanglements with the field. But I want to briefly focus on what I think the book is of particular relevance and importance for me as a post-colonial scholar and digital migration scholar, and I hopefully managed to spark some further thinking on how to move beyond the binary of the digital or border thinking. What I find particularly compelling was the ways in which the book deals with the notion of the digital border as an assemblage that bring us to reflect not only on the materiality of borders, geography and demarcation lines through space and technology, but also on their symbolic construction through mediatization and narrativization, and also to include next to space the notion of time, analyze the ways in which the borders have become an embodiment of crisis. And how this notion of crisis from 2015 onward has jeopardized the possibility of thinking on a planetary scale, as it is referred with the opening in the book to a Shield member who had the rightful inhabitants of this earth. So thinking about a shared common humanity, and as Pogi Roy and Gayatri Spivak would say, a planetary entanglements. And also the book closes with Achim Bemberg, which is not only an analysis of the media system and the humanitarian crisis, but also the ethical commitment to think further what's next. So the book offers a sophisticated and theoretical framework, which is the result of productive dialogues among many different disciplines. And I mentioned border studies, critical data studies, migration studies, digital urban studies, border studies, but also humanitarian communication. And it's also very ambitious in scope to deal with issues of the city and citizenship, mobility and migration, borders and boundaries, security and surveillance, autonomy and agency, resistance and resilience, as well as visuality and imagination. And all this keeping the concept of crisis as central as a tool for ontologizing otherness. So what I found particularly important and innovative in these books was not only the careful analysis of what constitute digital borders, how the assemblage of material symbolic construction constitute violent operations, because they make the They perpetuate inequality by putting the migrant as a space invader outside of the space of Europe and disrupting the fake idea of national homogeneity and cohesion. But I like the way in which digital border can be thought as contact zone of resistance and resilience, where alternative modalities of belonging and participation are articulated with or against the mediatic approach that continue to represent them outside of the space of Europe, not fully human and not fully citizen. In an editorial on special issues on post-colonial Europe called In the Name of Europe, I've written that borders are often moving from physical, the gate of European territories and citizenship, and symbolic, the myth of Europe and its idea of superiority, to material borders, the marked body of foreigners, immigrant, and asylum seeker, which become border figurations. So they actually embed this construction of otherness, foreignness, and alienness. These embodied borders come to signify somewhat cohesive category that pretty much in line with Said's notion of Orientalism, place the European subject as the host in a position of definition by default. Instead of being the signifier, the European subject becomes the hollow referent, a kind of blind spot that needs the other for his, her, or its self-definition. So the European is what the other is not, therefore unmarked by race, ethnicity, and religion, in reality implicitly constructed upon the idea of maleness, whiteness, and Christianity. So Wendy Brown has debated that the proliferation of border and the creation of new wall is not a resurgent expression of national state sovereignty in late modernity, but rather icon of its failure. The epidemic of building wall, be them digital or not, means that there is a corrosion actually of the idea of sovereignty and an erosion of its authority. So what Balibara said, the borders that define Europe are actually becoming very uncertain, and despite the constant refencing of Fortress Europe for digital surveillance as well, are vacillating. However, they have been replaced by multiple invisible and internal borders that mark new forms of inclusion and exclusion based on linguistic, racial, ethnic, and religion division that you analyze through all the different chapters in different kind of forms. So I wanted to just mention that the idea of Balibar, which he labeled as European apartheid, is still quite valid, because it makes a reference to type of exclusion that are implemented not only at the level of legislation, but also as a way in which Europe is constructed as a concept and creating this kind of border figuration predicated upon the migrants. So border tells this story of exclusion, marginalization, and violence, but what the volume achieves is also to articulate how they also offer avenues for care, conviviality, and solidarity. Borders are not ever just strictly digital or controlling, rather the author argues they become a kind of embedded in this digital and pre-digital, datafied and embodied, automated and self-reflective, so traversed by fluid and social relationship that can bring despair but also hope. So I would like to place the focus on the book on how the digital border is not just a top-down form of control and governmentality that you analyze really well through infrastructure, quantification, dehumanization, but also an opportunity to subvert and rethink the line of the border through detecting forms of autonomy, agency, and alternative imaginary that they also are carefully selected and collected through their fieldwork. On the island of Chios and other borderland locations, then resist the idea of being peripheral to Europe or offshoring the dirty laundry of the European Union. The book articulates how this resistance is often invisibilized. That is also the task of the researcher to listen to this instancy of agencies and authority. And this is, I think, the methodological question that maybe have asked, how do you do this? How do you bring this digital border to speak back to the infrastructure? I would like, as a way of conclusion, to point out to the notion that I think are connected but maybe not central to the argument of the book, such as the notion of cosmopolitanism, which refer to being citizens of the world and what Member rightly defines as the rightful people of the earth, in opposition to notion of nationality and nationalism, around which the idea of the border seems to continue to thrive. It would be interesting to see or to hear more how this notion of the digital border figure with the idea of cosmopolitanism, and whether a world without borders would actually mean the end of inequality, because it seems now that because of the borders, now we have all these other axes of injustices. Furthermore, what do you think of the notion of planetariness, and how does this offer an imaginative life from the move towards a world without borders? So that's what my comment, and thank you so much for sharing the book with us.
Thank you. So lots on the table. Are there any burning questions from the room? Then we can maybe take one of those as well before we have maybe response to the respondents. I'm also trying to look at the teams, if there's anything, maybe questions that people have posed in the chat. Otherwise, Myria, would you like to respond to the responses?
Okay, so thank you for that. I'm honored, touched and moved really from having the two of you commenting so generously on our book, and I'm sure Lilie would be the same if she was here. Again, I think the comments that you made, each one of you separately and two of you together, really already contribute to the wider conversations we will be having during the day. So I'll try not to take too much time, but to tackle directly your questions. So to go to the question of demediation. I think that this is such an interesting and provocative question, and of course it has to do also with the way that I'm sure again we will be talking during the day about the ways that we think about mediation. So there's one level of we can answer these questions in two different ways. The first way to answer the question is that no, we cannot speak outside mediation, because mediation is very much the way through which we engage with the narratives and the technologies that we understand migration. So migration is really the way that we understand it. It cannot be perceived outside mediation. And in relation to the discipline where I come from, we could say that theorizations of mediation as part of mediatization would give a negative answer to that. However, we have there is another way to say if there is demediation, and that's the way to say yes, there is. And this is more of an empirically driven response to the question of demediation that understands perhaps mediation more narrowly and through that lens of perhaps Roger Silverstone, that recognizes how the entanglements of the creation of meanings through our engagement with technologies and media representations, but it is a theorization which does not necessarily imply that our whole existence happens through mediation. And empirically, I think there's a basis to stop and think about, the possibility of the moments outside mediation. Here, of course, I'm also thinking of more recent scholarship, such as that of by Natale and Trere, who talk about disconnection. And there's a whole intellectual movement now that is thinking around this idea of disconnection, how we can think of life and politics and society beyond this idea that everything and we're all constantly connected. So in relation to this scholarship, the Silverstonian mediation on the one hand and Natale and Trere disconnection theorization on the other, I could say that we indeed saw moments of demediation, and in many ways demediation is political as well. So we see people withdrawing, activists and migrants withdrawing from mediated spaces, for example, because they're precisely very much aware that all those spaces are constantly surveyed and their data is constantly extracted. we've seen activists and migrants withdrawing from spaces of mediation as a genuine project of identity and community, such as the project of the Arabic Library in Berlin, for example, which is a project organized, developed and organized by a group of young, and I have to emphasize the young Arab refugees in Berlin, who deliberately say, we think and work and connect through books. We don't want to do it digitally, because the books have their own smell, and there is a way to engage with culture and with each other through books. That's why I'm emphasizing they're young, because these are not only conversations that are generationally defined. The methodology. So thinking about how we study the border and its methodologies. As you can see, this is a very multi-methodological approach, especially Lilie Chouliaraki and I come from different intellectual traditions, and I'm very much engaged in ethnographic research, while, of course, Lilie Chouliaraki is well known for her work with text and discourse analysis. This has been a great experience from both of us, and I think we have both learned from each other. But mostly what we learned from is our engagements with the actors of the border. And the voices of the actors of the border, that more and more, the deeper we went into our research, the more aware we became that any story of the border has to be a story that recognizes and brings forward the different voices of the actors of the border, not only the voices that we like, such as the migrants and the activists, for example, but also the police and the army, because that helps us understand, for example, the experience with the Greek border police, where we saw people saying, yes, we are helping those who are coming because look at them, they need our help. But look at them, how they sit and how they are not like us. So paying attention to voice really reveals, we felt, that contradiction of the border. And then there's the ethical question that brings me to your other point, that the study of the border for us requires a deep ethical political commitment, and the recognizing voice, doing as much justice to voice, but also co-creating narratives and sharing the ownership of the narratives that we produce is fundamental, I think, to ethical research. So it's ethical research practice, but it's also the ethical political stand that we take is also one of responsibility, where you end up with. And indeed here we're again very much inspired by the work of the late Roger Silverstone and his work on Mediapolis, where he's really inviting us to think about the responsibility of our scholarship. And if we are to study media and communications, why are we doing it? And I think this question remains fundamental to us. And of course, in many ways, it's an unresolved question. But we think that we're committed to the normative scholarship, that we want to make a contribution to the to public debates, to the issues that matter, especially, again, doing justice to the people that we're engaging with in our scholarship. And this, of course, relates also to Sandra's very eloquent response that I think you already touched upon. Those alternative imaginaries, the recognizing spaces of autonomy, of agency, of political resistance to the European apartheid, and so on. If we don't have borders, does this mean that we end inequalities? And I think that's an issue that we will come back to when we talk about your book as well, Hub. Probably not, but it's a way forward. It is about recognizing injustices, and injustices, of course, are expressed in different spaces and intersectionally, as we know. But the reason that we also tried in the book to talk both about nationalism, Eurocentrism, and the market and capitalism is precisely to remind ourselves that it is not, nationalism does not exist on its own right, but very often what we see is that borders emerge within a regime of neoliberal nationalism, where the interest of the market and the state converge, and the order of movement and bodies is very much subjected to a combination of the two. So I think it would be wrong to think that borders will bring this utopian society, but of course, as the borders represent this convergence of order and these different forms of oppression, I think we have to question them, at least in the forms of governmentality that we see at the moment. Thank you.